Is it truly possible to steal a blessing? Can the fate of one person be wrested away and placed in the hands of another through deception? These are not just ancient questions, but deep spiritual ones that cut to the heart of justice, morality, and divine will. When Jacob, guided by his mother Rebekah, sets out to steal the blessing meant for his brother Esau, the entire foundation of what is right seems to tremble. How could God allow such a theft? Can a future destined for one be seized by another? Isaac, blind and frail, prepares to give his final blessing to Esau, his eldest, in what should be a sacred act, passed down through generations. But Rebekah, listening from the shadows, plots a different outcome. Could Jacob, the quiet son, actually take Esau's place in this divine order? Rebekah believes it's possible, but at what cost? The promise to Abraham, the lineage of a nation, hangs in the balance. Can destiny be manipulated so easily? Esau, Isaac's favored son, is away hunting, unaware that his future is being plotted against. How could a single act of deception change the course of history? For Rebekah, the answer seems simple. If Jacob can disguise himself as Esau, he can seize the blessing. But would God truly honor a blessing obtained through such treachery? Isn't a blessing sacred, unbreakable, and destined for the one chosen? The weight of these questions looms over Jacob as he listens to his mother's dangerous plan. As Rebekah whispers her scheme, Jacob feels the tension rising within him. Could a lie really alter God's will? Is he about to commit a sin that will curse him forever? Or could this be part of God's mysterious plan? Jacob's heart pounds with doubt, but the promise of the blessing is too powerful to ignore. The blessing, a divine inheritance, offers not just wealth, but power and leadership. What if this one lie could change everything? In this world, the blessing of the firstborn was more than words. It was destiny, control over nations, a covenant with God. But how could such a blessing be transferred through deceit? Wouldn't God intervene, or at least reject this stolen gift? The act Rebekah proposed felt not only dangerous but sacrilegious. Could Jacob truly take Esau's place by simply pretending to be him? It was a question that would haunt Jacob with every step he took. Isaac, blind and unaware, prepared to bless the wrong son. His decision, guided by trust and tradition, carried divine weight. But what happens when trust is betrayed? Would the blessing still hold if given to the wrong person? Does God honor a stolen blessing, or would it carry a curse instead? Jacob didn't know the answer. All he knew was that this might be his only chance. Could he risk everything for something not meant for him? Jacob's feet felt heavy as he neared his father's tent. Was this really his path to greatness, or was he sealing his own downfall? The blessing of Abraham, the promise of a future nation, seemed within reach. But could Jacob live with the deception it would take to grasp it? His mother's words rang in his ears. "The curse be on me, my son." But could Rebekah really bear the burden of what they were about to do? As Jacob took a deep breath and stepped toward his father's tent, the air around him felt thick with impending betrayal. Could one act of deceit truly reshape the future of an entire people? Or was this the beginning of a curse that would haunt him forever? The questions swirled, but there was no turning back. With the weight of a stolen future pressing down on him, Jacob crossed the threshold into the shadows of destiny. Jacob's dilemma, lies and morality. Jacob's feet felt like lead as he followed his mother's orders. Could he really go through with this? His father had never been a cruel man, but lying to him felt like betraying something sacred. The weight of deception pressed down on Jacob's shoulders. Was he about to tarnish the legacy of his family? Rebekah's words echoed in his mind. "The curse be on me." But could she really bear the burden if everything fell apart? The tent loomed before him. Inside, Isaac waited, vulnerable, trusting, blind. Could he deceive his own father? Jacob paused, the goat skins draped across his arms and neck, a twisted mockery of his brother's rough skin. His heart raced. What if Isaac touched him and knew? What if he recognized the voice that didn't belong to Esau? The risk was immense, but so was the reward. Could one blessing really change the fate of nations? Rebekah had been clear. This is the only way. But Jacob's conscience gnawed at him. Deception had always carried a heavy price in their family's history. Hadn't Abraham lied about Sarah being his sister to protect himself, nearly bringing disaster on them? Was this any different? Would God punish them for taking matters into their own hands? The irony wasn't lost on Jacob. He was about to steal the very blessing that was meant to bring divine favor. Jacob thought of the times God had chosen the younger over the elder, Abel over Cain, Isaac over Ishmael. Was this another one of those moments where God's choice defied human convention? Perhaps this deception was part of a larger plan, one that he couldn't yet see. But that didn't make it any easier. Was he destined for greatness? Or was he simply a pawn in his mother's game? He felt trapped, caught between ambition and morality. If the curse be on her, then why do I feel it already? Jacob wondered as he neared the tent. The goatskins scratched his neck, a physical reminder of the lie he was about to tell. Esau was out in the wilderness, unaware that his birthright was slipping away. Could God bless something that was stolen? Jacob's thoughts were a whirlwind of doubt and guilt. He could still turn back, but the promise of the blessing was too alluring to resist. Inside the tent, Isaac sat, unaware of the impending betrayal. Jacob's hand hovered over the flap, hesitating. He thought of his father's blindness, the way Isaac had always favored Esau. But wasn't this Isaac's fault? He had chosen to bless the wrong son. Jacob's thoughts grew darker. Was it really wrong to correct such a mistake? The blessing was meant for the one who would carry the family's legacy. And wasn't that Jacob? His breath quickened as he stepped inside. Isaac's voice broke the silence. "Who is it, my son?" The moment of truth had arrived. Could Jacob really lie to his father's face? His throat tightened as he spoke, his voice trembling with uncertainty. "It is I, Esau, your firstborn." The lie felt foreign on his tongue, like poison. Would Isaac see through it, or would his blindness extend to his heart as well? Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears as Isaac motioned for him to come closer. As Jacob approached, he felt the weight of the goatskins on his arms like chains. This wasn't just a lie, it was a betrayal of everything his father stood for. Isaac's hand reached out, tentative, searching. His fingers brushed against the goatskins, and Jacob held his breath. What if Isaac knew? The moments stretched into eternity. "The voice is Jacob's," Isaac murmured, "but the hands are Esau's." The lie had taken root, but could it hold? The deception, preparing for the act. Rebekah's hands moved quickly, gathering the materials for the deception. Could this really work? The goatskins felt rough and unnatural, but they would have to do. Jacob's smooth arms were nothing like Esau's, but Isaac's blindness would be their shield. What if Isaac touched his face, his hands? Jacob's pulse quickened as he felt the weight of the deception pressing down. The room seemed to close in on him. He was stepping into a trap of his own making. As Rebekah draped Esau's garments over Jacob, the scent of the wilderness clung to him. Could the smell alone fool Isaac? Jacob wasn't sure. He had always been the quiet son, staying close to home, while Esau roamed the fields and forests. The difference between them was stark, but in this moment, Jacob was being asked to become someone else. Was this the cost of destiny? The blessing was within reach, but the price was his integrity. Each step toward the tent felt heavier than the last. Was this really the path to the blessing? Rebekah's voice echoed in his mind, urging him forward, but Jacob's heart ached with doubt. His father was old, blind, and trusting. Could he really betray that trust? The lie felt monstrous now, growing larger with each passing moment. But Rebekah's plan was flawless, or so it seemed. Jacob's only role was to carry it out, but the burden felt immense. Jacob's thoughts drifted to the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve had covered themselves with fig leaves after their sin, hiding from God. Was he doing the same? The goatskins on his arms felt like a false covering, a thin disguise for the guilt that burned within. What would happen if Isaac saw through the ruse? Would Jacob be cursed like Adam, cast out from the favor he so desperately sought? The stakes were higher than ever. Rebekah's determination fueled Jacob's steps. Could she be wrong? Was this plan truly from God, or was it a mother's ambition for her son? The line between destiny and manipulation blurred. Hadn't God already promised that Jacob would lead? But the method seemed wrong, twisted. If God wanted Jacob to receive the blessing, why not allow it to happen honestly? Or was this another one of God's mysterious tests, like Abraham's call to sacrifice Isaac? As Jacob approached the tent, his hand hovered over the entrance. Was it too late to turn back? The smell of Esau's garments filled his nostrils, a constant reminder of the lie he was about to tell. His throat tightened. He could hear Isaac's faint breathing from within, the man who had raised him, loved him. Would this lie sever that bond forever? Jacob's mind raced with doubt, but his feet remained planted. There was no turning back. With a deep breath, Jacob entered the tent. The dim light flickered against the walls, casting long shadows. Could Isaac sense the deception in the air? The thought gnawed at Jacob as he stepped closer to his father's bed. Isaac's eyes, clouded and blind, stared into the distance, unaware of the storm about to break. Jacob's pulse pounded in his ears. Could this blessing, stolen in darkness, really lead to light? The silence between them grew thick with tension. "Who are you, my son?" Isaac's voice was weak, but the question pierced Jacob's heart. Who was he? Was he still Jacob, or had he become Esau in this moment? The question hung in the air, a test of more than just identity. Jacob swallowed hard, forcing the words out. "I am Esau," he lied. The deception was complete, but at what cost? His father's trust? His own soul? As Isaac beckoned him closer, the weight of the blessing pressed down even harder. The deception in action, the moment of betrayal. Jacob stepped forward, his heart pounding. Isaac's frail voice broke the silence. "Who are you, my son?" The words felt like a blade. Jacob's throat tightened, his hands trembled. Could he really go through with this? His mind screamed to stop, to confess, but his lips moved, betraying him. "It is I, Esau," Jacob lied, the words foreign on his tongue. He stood, waiting for Isaac's response, the weight of the lie pressing down on his chest like a stone. Isaac's blind eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into his voice. "Come closer, so I can touch you." Jacob's breath caught in his throat. He stepped forward, the rough goat skins wrapped around his arms like a second skin. Isaac's hands reached out, tentative, searching. Would the deception hold? The silence between them was thick, heavy. Isaac's fingers brushed against Jacob's arms, feeling the rough texture. His hands paused and Jacob's heart stopped. "The voice is Jacob's," Isaac murmured, his brow furrowing. "But the hands are Esau's." Jacob held his breath. Could his father see through the lie? Isaac's hands lingered on Jacob's arms, the confusion clear on his face, but then slowly Isaac nodded. The lie had worked. Jacob's legs felt weak with relief, but the guilt weighed heavily on him. Was this really how he was meant to receive the blessing? Would God honor something stolen? Isaac began the blessing, his voice steady, yet filled with an ancient power. "May God give you heaven's dew and earth's richness." Jacob's mind spun. Was this moment real? His father's hand still rested on his arms, sealing his future. But Jacob's thoughts were elsewhere. Esau was out in the fields, unaware that his birthright had been taken. The words Isaac spoke would change everything. But could Jacob live with the knowledge of how he had obtained them? The blessing continued, each word sinking deeper into Jacob's soul. "May nations serve you and peoples bow down to you." Isaac's voice was soft but resolute. Jacob had won. The blessing was his. But the triumph he had expected didn't come. Instead, a heavy silence settled in his heart. The weight of his deception pressed down harder. He had stolen the future meant for his brother. But could a future stolen truly be a future blessed? As Isaac finished the blessing, his hands dropped and Jacob stepped back. The reality of what had just happened sinking in. Could he ever undo what he had done? His father's face was peaceful, unaware of the storm Jacob had just unleashed. Jacob had received the blessing, but at what cost? He had lied to his father, stolen from his brother. The future was now his, but so were the consequences. Would God judge him for this deception? Jacob left the tent, his legs shaky, his heart heavy. He had the blessing, but the guilt clung to him like the goat skin still wrapped around his arms. Esau would return soon, and then? Then what? Could he face his brother after what he had done? His mind raced with the possibilities. Would Esau kill him in his rage? Would Isaac curse him if the truth came out? The blessing was his, but the future felt darker than ever. As the door of the tent closed behind him, Jacob's pulse quickened. He had the blessing, but was it truly his? Each step felt like a betrayal, not only to his father, but to himself. Had this deception changed him forever? The words of the blessing still echoed in his mind, but so did the lie. Who was he now? Could a stolen blessing ever bring peace? The shadows lengthened as Jacob stood alone, the weight of the future pressing down. The weight of the stolen blessing, immediate consequences. Jacob barely escaped the tent when he heard the sound of heavy footsteps approaching. Esau was back. Jacob's heart pounded in his chest, each beat an urgent reminder of the storm he had just created. What would happen when Esau discovered the truth? His mind raced. He had the blessing, but now he had to face the consequences of his deceit. The blessing had been sealed with Isaac's words, but Jacob knew that Esau's reaction could end it all. Inside the tent, Esau's booming voice called out to Isaac, full of pride and confidence. He had returned from his hunt, ready to receive the blessing he believed was rightfully his. Could this moment be any crueler? Jacob's stomach twisted as he listened from the shadows. He could imagine the look on Esau's face, first joy, then confusion, and finally, the fury that would follow. Was it too late to flee? Jacob's feet felt glued to the ground. Isaac's confusion grew as Esau approached, offering the meal he had prepared. "Who are you?" Isaac's voice trembled with uncertainty. The question hung in the air, heavy with the weight of betrayal. Esau's answer, "I am Esau, your firstborn," hit Isaac like a blow. The truth dawned on him in an agonizing wave. Jacob had deceived him, taken what was never meant to be his. The betrayal stung deeper than any physical wound. Could Isaac ever trust Jacob again? Esau's cry of anguish reverberated through the camp, raw and guttural. "Bless me too, Father. Haven't you reserved any blessing for me?" But Isaac's heart sank. The blessing had already been spoken, sealed by divine authority, and it could not be undone. What had been stolen could not be reclaimed. "Your brother came deceitfully and took your blessing," Isaac admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The air between them thickened with the realization of what had transpired. Esau's body trembled with rage. His future, everything he had worked for, had been stolen in the blink of an eye. "Isn't he rightly named Jacob?" Esau spat, his voice thick with bitterness. The name Jacob, meaning supplanter, now felt like a cruel prophecy fulfilled. Jacob, the deceiver, had lived up to his name, stealing the very thing that had been promised to Esau. How could a brother betray like this? Esau's fists clenched, his mind spinning with thoughts of vengeance. The weight of what Jacob had done now fell squarely on his shoulders. The blessing, once a coveted prize, now felt like a heavy burden. Could he bear the cost of his actions? Esau's rage wasn't just an emotional outburst, it was a vow. "I will kill him," Esau whispered, fury blazing in his eyes. Jacob's life was now in danger. The consequences of his deceit had escalated beyond anything he had imagined. Was the blessing worth his life? Rebekah, sensing the danger, quickly intervened. She had orchestrated this deception, but even she hadn't foreseen the depth of Esau's fury. She knew that Jacob's only chance of survival was to flee. But where could he go? As Esau stormed out of the tent, Rebekah pulled Jacob aside. Her voice, usually steady and calm, now trembled with urgency. "You must leave at once. Go to my brother Laban." Jacob's heart sank. He had the blessing, but now he was being sent into exile. As Jacob prepared to flee, the full weight of his actions settled on him. He had what he wanted, the blessing of the firstborn, but at what cost? Was this the price of destiny? The future felt uncertain, darker than before. Jacob had deceived his father, stolen from his brother, and now he was running for his life. Would this blessing bring him prosperity, or had he cursed his own future? Only time would tell. Jacob's escape, internal conflict, and exile. The sun had barely risen when Jacob left his home, the place he had known all his life. Was this what the blessing had brought him? Exile and fear? The path ahead was long and uncertain. As he walked through the wilderness, each step seemed to echo the betrayal he had committed. Would he ever see his family again? Or was he destined to wander, a fugitive from his own brother's vengeance, carrying the weight of a stolen future? As Jacob journeyed further, the silence around him became unbearable. The blessing, once his greatest desire, now felt like a curse. Was this really God's plan? Hadn't he been told that he would lead nations, that he would carry the promise of Abraham and Isaac? But now he was alone, with no family, no protection, only the lingering guilt of deception. Could God still honor a blessing gained through lies? The wilderness reflected the emptiness inside him. Jacob thought of Moses, who also fled into the wilderness after committing an act he couldn't undo. Like Moses, Jacob had acted rashly, without considering the long-term consequences. Would God meet him in the desert, as he had with Moses, or was Jacob beyond redemption? The thought haunted him as he trudged on, the weight of the stolen blessing pressing down with every step. Could he ever escape the shadow of his own deceit? The night fell, and Jacob was left alone with his thoughts, the stars above him, silent witnesses to his internal turmoil. Was this truly what his life had become, running from the past? The memories of his father's touch, his brother's anger, and his mother's desperation swirled in his mind. Was this blessing worth the pain it caused? As he lay on the cold ground, Jacob wrestled with the enormity of his choices. Would God ever forgive him? With no one to turn to, Jacob's thoughts drifted to the stories of his ancestors. Hadn't God worked through broken men before? Abraham had lied about Sarah being his wife, and yet God had still honored his promises. Was there still hope for Jacob? He had deceived, stolen, and now fled. But hadn't God always found a way to use flawed people for his purposes? But how could God work through someone who had betrayed his own family? Jacob's heart was heavy with doubt, but the silence of the wilderness offered no answers. He felt as though he had been abandoned, not just by his family, but by God himself. Was this exile permanent? The blessing, once so tangible, now felt like a distant memory, overshadowed by the consequences of his actions. Could he ever find peace, or was his future forever tainted by the choices he had made? The questions gnawed at him, but there was no one to answer. As dawn broke, Jacob knew that his journey was far from over. Would he ever return home? Could he face his father again, or worse, his brother? The road to Laban's house stretched out before him, but it wasn't just a physical journey. This was a journey of the soul, a reckoning with his own guilt and ambition. Jacob had been given the blessing, but now he had to live with it. Could he bear the weight of what he had done? Jacob's feet moved forward, but his heart remained behind, tangled in the web of lies he had spun. Was there any way to untangle the knots, to find redemption on the other side? The wilderness stretched endlessly ahead, offering no answers, only more questions. But deep inside, Jacob knew that this was only the beginning. The blessing was his, but so was the burden, and only time would reveal what that truly meant. Encounter with God, Jacob's transformation. The weight of Jacob's guilt pressed down on him as he lay beneath the stars. Could he ever find redemption? His thoughts swirled with doubt, uncertainty clouding his every step. But as sleep overtook him, something changed. A vision began to unfold. Jacob saw a ladder stretching from earth to heaven with angels ascending and descending. At the top, the Lord stood, speaking words of promise. Could God still be with him, despite his deception? The voice of the Lord echoed in Jacob's dream. I am the Lord, the God of your father Abraham and the God of Isaac. I will give you and your descendants the land on which you are lying. The words pierced through Jacob's guilt, offering a glimpse of hope. Could it be true? Even after all he had done, was the promise still his? The dream was vivid, tangible, unlike anything Jacob had ever experienced. Had God not abandoned him? As Jacob awoke, his heart raced. Surely the Lord is in this place, he whispered, overwhelmed by the vision. He had fled in fear, burdened by his deception, but now it seemed that God had not forsaken him. Was this a new beginning? Jacob felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that perhaps his journey wasn't just physical, but spiritual. Could this be the turning point? The vision had been clear. God was still with him, even in exile. The ladder in Jacob's dream was more than a mere vision. It was a bridge between heaven and earth, a sign that God's presence was not limited by Jacob's failures. But what did it mean for his future? The blessing had been stolen, but the promise had not been revoked. The God of Abraham and Isaac was still offering Jacob a future. Could Jacob live up to it? The question weighed on him, but the vision offered hope where there had been none. Jacob's heart softened as he reflected on the dream. God had met him in his darkest hour, just as he had met others before. Jonah had fled, only to be swallowed by a great fish, and yet God had used him. Could Jacob's exile be part of a greater plan? The guilt that had clung to him now felt lighter, though not entirely gone. Had God forgiven him? Jacob wasn't sure, but for the first time he felt a sense of purpose in his journey. With renewed determination, Jacob rose from his makeshift bed. This land was now part of his future, part of the promise God had reaffirmed. He had been running, not only from Esau but from his own guilt. But now, something had shifted. The blessing, though stolen, still carried divine weight. Could he live up to the promise? The journey ahead would be long, and reconciliation seemed far off. But Jacob felt a new resolve stirring within him. Jacob took a stone, setting it up as a pillar, and poured oil on top of it. This place would be known as Bethel, the house of God. The act felt sacred, a way to mark the moment when his despair had turned to hope. Could this truly be a new beginning? As he knelt before the pillar, Jacob made a vow. If God will be with me and watch over me on this journey, then the Lord will be my God. The words hung in the air, a covenant between him and the Almighty. The sun rose, casting light on the path ahead. Jacob had been a deceiver, a man running from his past. But now, with the vision of the ladder fresh in his mind, he felt something new, a sense of divine purpose. He didn't know what lay ahead or how he would ever reconcile with his brother, but he knew this: God was with him, and that, for now, was enough. Jacob's redemption and reconciliation. Years passed as Jacob lived in exile with Laban, learning, growing, and wrestling with the consequences of his actions. But the day of reckoning was coming. He couldn't run forever. The memory of Esau's rage haunted him. But now, something was different. Jacob was no longer the man who had stolen the blessing. Time had softened him, and his encounter with God had changed him. Could Esau ever forgive him? Or was the divide between them too great? As Jacob journeyed back to the land of his fathers, fear gripped his heart. Would Esau still seek revenge? The closer he came, the more the memories of that fateful day haunted him. The stolen blessing, the deception, it all weighed heavily. But Jacob knew he had to face his brother. Could there be peace after all these years? Or would their meeting end in bloodshed? Jacob's heart raced as he prepared for the confrontation of a lifetime. In an act of humility, Jacob sent gifts ahead to Esau, hoping to soften his brother's heart. But even that didn't ease his fear. What if Esau rejected the gifts? What if they weren't enough to bridge the gap created by his betrayal? As Jacob approached Esau, he bowed 7 times, a gesture of submission, a plea for mercy. Would it be enough? Jacob's eyes stayed low, his heart pounding with fear and regret. Was this the end? To Jacob's astonishment, Esau didn't strike. Instead, Esau ran to him, embraced him, and kissed him. The tears that fell were not of anger, but of reconciliation. Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Could it really be this simple? The years of bitterness, the vow of vengeance, it had all melted away in a single embrace. Was this the power of divine forgiveness? Jacob stood there, stunned, as Esau held him. The weight of years lifted from his soul. The stolen blessing had led Jacob down a long, hard road, but now it felt as though the journey had come full circle. Could the wound truly heal? The brothers had once been rivals, their relationship fractured by deceit and ambition. But now, standing before each other, it seemed that time and grace had done what Jacob never thought possible. Esau had forgiven him. The blessing, though stolen, had brought them back together in the end. As the brothers talked, Jacob reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He had started as a deceiver, a man willing to betray his own family for a blessing. But through his trials, his exile, and his encounter with God, Jacob had been transformed. The blessing had never been about power or prosperity. It had been about becoming the man God intended him to be. Could this have been God's plan all along? A journey not of deception, but of redemption. Years later, as Jacob looked back on his life, he saw the twists and turns that had shaped him. He had once stolen a blessing, but through that act, he had been forced to confront his own brokenness. God had taken his deception and turned it into something greater. Could God always work through human flaws? Jacob smiled at the thought. His story had begun with a lie, but it ended with grace. The journey wasn't over. Jacob's descendants would face their own struggles, their own moments of failure and redemption. But Jacob knew one thing for certain. God's promises were unshakable. Even through deceit, even through exile, God had remained faithful. The blessing had been his all along, not because he had stolen it, but because God had chosen him. And that, Jacob realized, was the greatest blessing of all.